All right. We're a minute or two past the top of the hour here, so I think we can get things started. So first off, thank you to everyone for joining us today for this great panel discussion we have around resetting expectations for supply chain security. Just to level set, the session will be about an hour long. We will include a question and answer portion towards the end of the session. This will be recorded, so we will have this to share out afterwards. I'd like to just remind you, any questions can come in through the Q&A panel in the Zoom meeting. So send over those questions and we'll get to as many as we can. And we just want to thank all of the speakers on today, and we will kick things off now. So Kelly, take things away, please.
Thank you, Nate, and thank you for joining us today. I'm really pleased to be joined by Errol and Sam, who I'll allow them to introduce themselves here in a moment, for a really rich discussion, I think, that we've prepared for you on third-party risk management and the impacts to organizations. And wow, you know, things seem to have changed dramatically in the last few years as it's related to third-party risk management, with so many events happening in the world, and there's some pressing on us right now. It seems like we roll from one to the next, which has really brought this whole universe of third-party and supply chain risk management to the front of the minds of CISOs and boards of directors and governments, because it's really proving to be quite challenging. My name's Kelly White. I'll be moderating and maybe throwing in some of my own input here and there. I'm the founder of RiskRecon, a company that provides cybersecurity ratings and insights. It makes it easy to understand and act on third-party risks in the cyber dimension. And as I mentioned, we're joined by Errol Weiss and Sam Olyaei. I'll turn it to each of you in turn. First, Errol, to introduce yourselves before we get going. And real quick, we will be leaving about 20 minutes at the tail end of this. I expect, based on this conversation, that you'll have a lot of questions for us here. So, Errol, take it away with your intro.
Great, Kelly. Thanks so much. Really, I'm so glad to be here with you and the rest of the RiskRecon Mastercard team. Again, my name is Errol Weiss. I'm the Chief Security Officer with Nth ISAC. Nth ISAC is a global nonprofit industry association that provides information sharing analysis services for the healthcare sector. I've been in this role about 3 years. Prior to coming here, I was in the banking and finance sector between places like Citibank and Bank of America, where I created and ran the cyber threat intelligence function for Citibank, and did that for about 8 years. And of course, I was a very active user with the FS-ISAC, which is where I met Kelly earlier on in his career. And again, prior to that, started my career way back at the National Security Agency, where I was doing penetration testing before getting into the private sector and getting into information security there as well. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Errol. Sam.
Thanks, Kelly. Hey, everybody. Really excited to be part of this group. Name's Sam Olyaei. I'm a senior research director here at Gartner, a research and advisory firm, which many of you may know. I have the pleasure of knowing Kelly for a couple of years now, since starting the cybersecurity ratings coverage here at Gartner. I predominantly focus on the program management aspect of cybersecurity in my research and advisory interactions with clients. So I do a lot of, board interactions, talent management, policy development, things of that nature. And I focus pretty much very heavily on the executive side of cybersecurity. Before I joined Gartner, I had a past life in incident response forensics and malware analysis for a couple of different response providers. And before that, I was in the hedge fund industry working in due diligence. So that's a little about me, and really excited to join the group here.
Hedge fund due diligence, malware analysis. I can see it.
Yeah, I left the tech world a while ago.
Well, thank you for taking the time with us, and thank you for all of those who are attending in the group. Please submit your questions and comments. We'll turn that over to Nate here at the end to moderate that part of it. Let's get going with just what's the most relevant thing in the world right now. And Sam, I'm going to throw this one to you to start.
Sure.
Russia's waging war against Ukraine, and that's top of our minds. I'm curious, I think we're all curious about what kind of inquiries are you fielding related to that as it relates to third-party risk, logical risk, supply chain.
Yeah.
Just give us that, and maybe kind of what's Gartner thinking?
Yeah. Let me start by let's pat ourselves on the back a little bit. Let's give our cybersecurity leaders a little bit of kudos. We've been really living in a cyber war kind of day-to-day life for the last few years that, when you have, issues, geopolitical issues, or, traditional warfare issues like the one we're seeing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you would think that cybersecurity would be the most impacted. And that's precisely true. It is one of the most impacted functions out there. But because of the proactiveness of a lot of our leaders and the advice and the strategies that we've developed, we're actually not the hardest hit function out there. If you just look at Gartner as a practice, the hardest hit functions in terms of scrambling to get advice out to our research, get research out to our clients, you're looking at areas like supply chain, you're looking at areas like finance, you're looking at areas like sales, right? And our cybersecurity leaders, while still kind of managing the day-to-day aspect of their operational and governance related functions, they're still very much working along the same lines of guidance that they had, 6 months ago. But more specifically, if you look at the types of questionings and the types of advice and the types of inquiries that are coming through, they're primarily focused on three things. One is resilience. And that's, I think, a key part of anything that you do. We've kind of shifted away from this idea of let's try and protect everything at the perimeter. And we're starting to focus a little bit more on, obviously, monitoring, detection, and response. But more importantly, organizations are now focusing on cyber resilience. We know we're going to get hit. We know we're going to get hacked, whether it's through a sort of a ransomware attack or a third-party breach or whatever the case might be. How do we ensure and how do we make sure our business remains resilient? And I think there's a lot of lessons learned in the aftermath of COVID. And that's precisely sort of one of the top inquiry calls we're getting. I think the other area that we're getting a lot of inquiry calls on is sort of from a threat perspective. And obviously the highest threat these days is, different strains of ransomware that exist out there. And again, so we're getting a lot of calls about, well, what do we do? Do we change any of our guidance? How do we manage a ransomware playbook? How do we take all that stuff and package it up to an executive level so that they can make a decision of whether to pay or not to pay the ransom, all that kind of stuff. And then the third piece is where we're kind of headed here is the supply chain and third party side. So organizations not only are starting to realize, but are now getting impacted by the supply chain issues and the logistical issues that their partners are facing. But more importantly, they're starting to realize that there's a cyber risk component associated with the supply chain and third party that's going to come back and impact them internally. So whether a vendor gets breached or a logical supplier or a physical supplier or a regulator comes out with a new regulation, a customer has a new requirement, to be ISO certified or to look at one of your SOC 2 audits or something like that, it's all coming back and hitting them at the forefront. So I think predominantly those are the three types of inquiries we're getting related to some of the geopolitical concerns we're seeing. But more broadly, this is stuff that we've been doing for years now.
Errol, you're like at the nexus of all the healthcare organizations of the world from a cybersecurity perspective. How's your organization? What are you doing as an industry group, and how do you view this geopolitical situation?
Yeah, Kelly, I think I have to agree with Sam in a lot of cases here. A lot of the examples and items that he put out certainly are very much in agreement with there. From the tactical standpoint, this has been an issue that we've been dealing with really for the last couple of months, right? Because we knew the increasing tensions and the threat of warfare were certainly coming. So there was a lot of preparation happening in addition to everything else above that we were working on. Since the I'll say the war phase of this event has actively started, people are definitely paying a lot more attention and thinking about some of you mentioned third party supply chain issues. We've got direct organizational impact as well. When you look at the healthcare sector, there are organizations who have facilities in Ukraine, in Russia, for example, doing things like research and development, supply chain, logistics, other employees that are there in terms of administrative offices, in addition to all of that. So now that we're in the phase of war here, we've got a lot of activity and action that's happening over and above even cyber, right? Like just thinking about sort of the controlled shutdown of operations if needed in both of those locations, and thinking about the day-to-day operational impact of what may happen if you're looking at enemy troops or combatants in the lobby of your building, right? What happens next? So there's been a lot of that. From the history standpoint, this sector's got a lot of memory, unfortunately, of what could go wrong in a cyber warfare environment. And there was definitely collateral damage years ago, 5 years ago or so, from things like Petya, not Petya, that this sector was impacted from, where we had regional warfare. That malware got out of control and started attacking other unintended targets, and suddenly we had impact in the sector. So taking events like that, there's also on top of that, people are going to want to take extra steps to make sure that they're not susceptible to malware as well.
Do either of you have a forecast on? So we've the political dynamics of cooperation and playing by rules and so on are gone, at least relative to where they were a couple months ago. So any joint action or enforcement of international law or treaties, things like that, probably on hold for a while. Do you expect that we're going to see an increase in cybercrime and ransomware activity? Will that be a front that's executed against the Western world? I mean, should we expect that as part of this? Any thoughts, Sam?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily expect to see an increase in the volume of cyber attacks, but I would expect to see an increase in the specificity and the target of these attacks. And we've seen this before in minor situations where it's essentially, historically, I mean, you have essentially two groups of crime actors. You have the crime actors that try to do this for financial benefit, and you have the crime actors that do this for political benefit. And the crime actors that do this for financial benefit have a strategy of throwing spaghetti on the wall and seeing what sticks, right? And the groups that do this for political benefit tend to have a more targeted strategy that's focused on chaos and disruption and things of that nature. So, I would say that the types of attacks are not the vast majority of attacks are not necessarily going to change in terms of the threat vectors that are commonly used, your phishing, your social engineering, those types of things. But when you start to get into the political nuances and the capabilities and resources of those entities, you are likely to see, zero-day vulnerabilities taking advantage of. But again, those would be specific, in my opinion, to specific targets. It would not be a mass attack.
Errol?
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that. I think that the bad guys on the cyber criminal side are always going to leverage sort of the current events in phishing themes that they will use. And to Sam's point, we'll see millions of email messages being sent out with the hopes that somebody's going to click on one of those. And especially also with the charity and relief organizations that are going on right now to help out people in Ukraine. Again, it's another dynamic that we see where the bad guys will invent their own charity, to look like something legitimate, and just in the hopes that people will donate to them and inadvertently or instead of. So I think we'll start to see that. But to me, it's unfortunate. Just the threat landscape never seems to get better. It just keeps getting worse as our criminals and state-sponsored cyber criminal or state-sponsored cyber actors just keep getting more creative and imaginative as every day passes.
Yeah. So, Errol, you mentioned some examples of organizations that you work with through the H-ISAC that have operations, throughout the world, and research and development, manufacturing, maybe some of their materials are coming out of there. How are things like this, and it's to both of you, but I guess first to you, Errol, how are things like COVID, pandemic that we've gone through, ransomware, the situation, the war that's Russia's waging in Ukraine, how is that changing the nature of the job of the CISO and perhaps the head of third-party cyber risk management, if at all?
Yeah, I think you're going down the right path there. I think the issues are historically, when we look at some of the major attacks, so go literally just over the past couple of years, you've got these third-party service provider attacks that have happened where the bad guys get into that network or that service provider. Now they've got potential access or a potential avenue to access their customers. So the idea is the attack once, and then you have access to many. So they have been doing, the adversary has been doing a very good job of that, and unfortunately. And so I think today in the mind of the CISO, and rightly so, these third-party service providers and trusted partners are certainly a big worry for many of them. And I think, Kelly, to the challenge here, it's very difficult, and I look at the time where I was when I spent at Citibank, for example. I know how hard it is to understand, like, where are all of your third-party connections, or who are all of your third-party partners? Sure, you can try to do an inventory. You can maybe get some feeds from your accounts payable department to try to understand, okay, if we're paying someone, it's a good likelihood that they're a third-party partner. But that's not everybody, right? That doesn't cover everybody, because you're not paying all of your third-party providers either, right? There may be research partners, for example, that you have a no-fee arrangement with. And they may have access to your network as well. So it's really hard to find out where all of these exist. And then to make the matters worse, when you look a year ago when we had the SolarWinds problem, looking at software that's got trusted access inside your own network, how do you identify things like that in the environment, get a handle on that, so that if something like that gets compromised by a threat actor, that they don't potentially have access to your entire network because of the privileges that utility or that management software has. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll take this up a couple of levels. I'll say that from a role perspective, we're actually seeing two things emerge, and the geopolitical tension we're seeing here just adds to this. The first thing we're starting to see is what we call the loss of control here at Gartner, and basically this refers to the idea that because of the involvement of third parties and citizen computing and business leader expectations kind of going through the roof, you're starting to see the cybersecurity leader or the CISO lose control of decision-making that's around cybersecurity in the organization, because there are a lot of other decision makers in the organization that make decisions about cyber without involving the cybersecurity leader. So what that essentially turns into is the cybersecurity leader now has a decision to make. And basically that decision is, if I continue across the path where I'm going to be that operational tactical leader and I want to police everything and control everything and be sort of that overseer, I'm going to have so many different parties that I'm going to deal with, to the point where that leader is going to be overworked, fatigued. We call it the always on mindset. So what that's doing is, there are a number of other cybersecurity roles that are emerging across the organization. So you start to see things like product security officers and platform security officers and cyber risk officers and things of that nature. So they're adding to the complexity of the role in the organization. The second thing we're seeing, and this is related to the perception at the board level and the business level, and this is precisely something that happened right in the aftermath of COVID, is board members and business executives, C-level business executives, looked at the situation and said, Well, we were able to pivot within 48 hours to a remote or work from home environment by bypassing all the security controls that we had in place, right? So the question came back to the CIO and to the CISO, why did we have these security controls in place in the first place if we didn't need them, if we just moved to virtual environment without any sort of conclusion there? So what that turned into is now a conversation about the value add of security to the business. So it's no longer about how much technology you're adding, what types of risks you're mitigating. It's, did you help me get more customers? Did you help improve my profits? Did you help improve our legal and reputational image? That's the conversation that's happening at the board level. So those are the two things I would say from a role perspective have changed in the last year and a half or so.
Let's bring it back. Let's bring it down to third party risk management specifically, and in the logical or cyber realm, whichever way you want to call it. How has that priority, at least as it looks at from a board of director radar, has that, and a CISO's radar, and they're probably two different things, as a priority? You know, how much are they paying attention to that? Has that attention to that increased over the last 5 years? And where are we at today? And why?
Yeah, I'll just answer that with one statistic, and then maybe Errol can add some more color to it. Our latest board of directors survey, which we actually go out and survey board of directors, the top two risks that they care about the most in the organization is number one, compliance risk, and number two, cyber risk. And that's cyber risk of all kinds. If you look at that same survey 3 years ago, cyber risk wasn't even on this list.
Really?
So, yeah.
And how long is that? I'm curious. How long is the list? Is it a 10 or is it a 5?
There's probably about 7 or 8 of those in there.
Wow.
Yeah. And I have a little hypothesis. I mean, there are other types of risks in there, like financial risk and market risk and credit risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have a little hypothesis that says the reason compliance and cyber are at the top of that list is because those are the two types of risks specifically that board members have no control, feel like they have no control over. Right. But anyway, that's a conversation for a different story.
Errol?
Yeah, I think, certainly like in the last, the time frame that we're talking here in the last 5 years, and I think also about, especially in the healthcare sector, from what I've seen here specifically in the last 3 years, the ransomware players have done a terrific job of providing awareness, unfortunately, about the value of the data and the number of breaches that have happened. And then, of course, the impacts from ransomware across the sector when it comes to patient safety. So it's definitely getting attention at the board level. And I think, to Sam's point, I think kinds of questions that I hear them asking are, are we safe? Do we know who our critical suppliers are? Where are the risks in those third-party suppliers? Are there any concentration risks that we need to be aware of? And then, are we as an organization spending the right amount of money?
Do you see?
Of course, the answer is no, by the way. Never spending enough.
Do you see some organizations answering those questions well and doing a good job at managing this third-party risk? Or is everybody still really behind where they need to be to manage this risk properly?
Oh, yeah. Sam, you want to start?
Sorry, Errol, I would say that, just again referring back to my database here, we have a maturity assessment at Gartner that we call internally IT score for cybersecurity, and basically it goes through all of the processes that we expect to see as part of a cybersecurity program. And one of those processes is the third-party security process. That's the least mature process across all of them in our database. So on a scale of 1 to 5 CMMI, which is the typical scoring platform range that we use, third-party security is likely an average of about a 1.8 on that scale of 1 to 5.
And,
so
and that's an ad hoc, right? So if you're in the 1, is that on the CMMI? Is that
on a CMMI scale? 1 is ad hoc-ish. But basically what that tells us is, I'll just tell you more from my personal and advisory interactions with clients. Most people don't deal with third-party risk because they don't know who owns third-party risk in the organization, and they feel like they shouldn't themselves. Two, the people who do own or do manage third-party risk only do it from a vendor perspective. So they equate third-party security or third-party risk management with vendor risk management or vendor security. So they don't take into account suppliers or regulators or customers and others. And the third thing I'd say is that those that do it well are still only focused on the static side of third-party security. And what that means is, the static assumptions of doing questionnaires and certifications and audits and things of that nature that tell us what have happened in the past, not tell us what's going to happen in the future. So it's not dynamic, it's not futuristic, it's not predictive analysis, it's prescriptive, if you will. It tells us it's sort of that point in time assessment. Those are my experiences, at least with the clients that I deal with.
Yeah, so I would add, I was thinking about how to answer, like how well are organizations doing that, and my answer was going to be, it really depends on the overall maturity level of the information security program. Sam took it even one notch even worse than that, saying that of those who are even doing it, they're not doing a great job of it. I probably tend to agree with that from what I've seen so far, unfortunately. I mean, I think, and Sam also touched on this earlier too, I think that it is true that there is a lot of debate about who owns this, and I think the CISOs probably would feel that they own the third-party information security risk, and I think that would be the right place to start. But again, to the bigger picture here, I do think that at some corporate level function, there should be an owner of that third-party risk management function, and it would include the things, again, like Sam had mentioned before, the fiscal risks, the other business risks associated with outsourcing and using those service providers, for example, in addition to the information security risks that come along with it.
So do you think that an organization, so there seems to be there appears to be a growing number of the risk domains that organizations are being asked to manage by externally, or they're choosing to internally. You think about environmental, social governance, and you add that to the traditional of financial privacy, and there's other things coming down the line. There's sanctions, there's all sorts of, there's an expansion of these. Is this going to, and given what you said about not having clear leadership, is this going to drive a reorganization? Are these things going to necessitate a reorganization so that there is a clear owner of this and there's a consolidation of, maybe execution and program where it might be more fragmented today and a bit more ad hoc? Is that coming? Sam?
I would actually argue the opposite. I would say there is no clear owner for a reason, because those things touch on a variety of different aspects. When you think about just cyber risk in general, it's not just the information side, it's also the cyber physical side. It could also be the vendor side. So you have to bring in procurement, and you have to bring in the operational technology folks and the legal folks and so on. So I actually what I expect to see is more distribution of roles across the organization, to the point where cybersecurity becomes more of an oversight function, and essentially the business units themselves would be in charge of making decisions on cyber risk rather than cybersecurity making decisions on cyber risk, which is what many organizations have today. So what I would say is not a reorg, but a refocus is probably what I would see. Because I've dealt with many cybersecurity leaders who basically not only have cybersecurity, but they have business continuity, they have privacy, they have identity and access management, they have third-party risk, and you can just keep adding on to that list. And the reason they keep adding to that list is because nobody in the organization wants to take advantage of it or wants to take ownership for it. So what you end up with is a situation where this leader is now, you can't focus on one thing or on one specific focus. They have to kind of focus on a broader strategy on things that don't mesh well together. And then the second thing you realize is that, regulations are going to start to push for these things individually. So just taking privacy as an example, GDPR will tell you need to designate a data protection officer. Well, data protection officer is not the same thing as a CISO. And, you'll start to see that as things emerge. So I think third party is still in that emerging phase, but we're going to get to a point where this becomes more of a holistic risk problem than an individual. But then ideally, there would be an enterprise risk management office or an enterprise risk office or a chief risk officer in charge of a lot of these sort of little risks at the bottom.
Okay. Have you, and this is an ad hoc question, unexpected one, but given the Gartner's assessment that we're at like a 1.8 on a 1 to 5 CMMI maturity scale, how much risk do you think organizations are taking on unnecessarily or avoidably because of that state? Have you quantified that, or can you articulate the magnitude of that? What are the
what that basically tells us, what the number tells us is that the average third-party risk management process is not repeatable and scalable across the organization. It's not that there's a lack of a process, it's just that it's not scalable and repeatable across multiple entities. So by default, when it's not scalable and repeatable across multiple entities, you're technically at a high level not actually doing a risk assessment on a lot of these entities and things that you've got left. So in reality, I would say the biggest issue, and maybe this is a segue to kind of get into our conversation here, but I think one of the biggest issues with third-party risk is discovery and identification. People don't know what they don't know. You can use all sorts of services, you can use all sorts of scans to identify what you might think are your third parties, but then there's always the fourth party, there's always the fifth party, there's always the supplier of that third party, there's always the MSSP that the third party deals with, that you have no idea that these things exist. And then on top of that, you have to add to what you add as well as these business unit executives and leaders that go out and procure SaaS applications without involving the cybersecurity team. Well, how do you identify those, right? So I think I wouldn't say necessarily it's more risks. I would just say it's newer kinds of risks.
So I'm gonna pose this to each of you, and I mean you can bounce back and forth on it however you want to do it. But if you are building a third-party cybersecurity risk management program from the ground up, and you've got that blank check to do that, what are the capabilities that are highest priority to you? Capabilities, functionality, so on, that you're gonna found that program on. And Errol, I'll kick it to you to get it going, but just throw stuff out there.
Yeah, I think building on top of what I had talked about before, where I think this also needs to live at a corporate enterprise level, because it does involve so many different parts of the organization to do it right. So it's not just a cyber problem; it does involve physical security. It does involve the business owners and leaders as part of that in the business risk process. I think that one of the other pieces, in the greenfields opportunity here that we're imagining, the other thing that I would really love to push on, we haven't talked about this yet, but is the whole shared assessments. I mean, I would really love to be able to leverage something like that, so that I, as the owner of this company XYZ, don't have to necessarily put the bill for every single one of the assessments that we're being asked to do, that I can leverage what's been done by others and use that as part of my overall risk management process.
I mean, you're basically the head of the H-ISAC and at the nexus of a large industry. Are you seeing some traction around the shared assessments? Or, no?
I wouldn't even dare to try to say yes, because this has been like conversations for over 20 years at this point. And for whatever reason, it is not taking off. And it does baffle me why it hasn't. And even when we see organizations get around the table and say, okay, yes, we can agree, this is the set of questions that we will use, and we all agree to this, and then it falls apart. So I haven't seen it work yet.
So you still want that? You still want that?
Yeah, Sam, I mean, just to finish off the thought there, when you look at how stretched thin we are, especially in healthcare, the cybersecurity budgets that we have, I would much rather be able to take that third-party security money that we're spending now for what benefit, to be able to use it elsewhere, potentially for much bigger bang for the buck.
Sam, any hope on the shared assessments model taking off at a reasonable scale? Do you want to see it happen?
I'm of the opinion that it all depends on the level of effort you put into it and the return on investment you get out of it. That's how I would evaluate third-party risk in general. I think that regardless of what you try and push out, whether it's the shared assessments model or something else, a standard in security ratings, for example, people are always going to come back and reinvent the wheel. I can't tell you how many questionnaires I've seen. My question to them is, why don't you just use a SIG, right? Well, we have these really specific requirements we want to make sure we ask. Well, at a high level, these things are going to be asked, right? But I'll be completely honest. I don't believe in the capability of a questionnaire at all. I think just doing that alone on some scale is fine, sufficient, but you're not even getting close to scratching the surface. And more importantly, you have no way of validating any of these answers. Now, there are some nuances to that, but that's how my research opinion.
Yeah. Well, over to you then. What's your?
I would do a couple of things. I would, the first thing I would do is I would introduce a process where I'm able to actually identify what the scope of my third parties are in the organization. So for some organizations, third party is purely about the vendors that they have. For other organizations, it might be about supply chain, and then you have to figure out, well, is it logical supply chain or physical supply chain? For some organizations, it extends all the way out to the customer. So my first recommendation is let's go out and figure out what that scope looks like. My second thing that I would do is I would try to figure out sort of the discovery and exposure capability. What kinds of exposure, now that you've identified your third parties, what kind of exposure do you have to these third parties? Is it a third party that comes in and provides, I don't know, support to something that's non-critical? Or is it a third party that you use that hosts your sensitive data or provides critical services to your business, or in some cases is a critical infrastructure provider, right? That to me tells you a lot of different things than in terms of what you need to do versus another. The third thing I would try to do is leverage the very large capability market that we have today in terms of risk evaluations based on the exposure that you've identified in step number 2. So again, if we go back to that example, and let's say we identified, a third party or a supplier or a regulator that we don't care about that much, doesn't have that much of a business impact, maybe a questionnaire would be sufficient. Let's send them a questionnaire. Or let's do a SWOT analysis and just sort of at a high level figure out what needs to be done there. But on the other hand, if it's a vendor that we host, that hosts our critical services or gives us or provides us with critical services, I need to go a little bit beyond that. I may need to run a security rating services scan. I may need to go beyond that and conduct an on-site risk assessment. I may need to go even beyond that and maybe run some breach attack and simulation platforms under perimeter and see how they would respond to some of these threat intel attacks and things of that nature. So I would use different evaluation methods based on the criticality of the third party that I've got. And then the last thing I would do is make sure I have a monitoring plan and a communication plan, because I then need to package up all the findings I've got and then show it to the board. And I need to show it to the board in a consumable manner, because the board members only care about 3 things. They care about revenue, they care about cost, and they care about value. If you talk about anything else, their minds are going to tune out immediately. And there are some boards that have created cybersecurity specific committees, so you need to be a little bit more tactical with them. And there's some boards where you're at the technology risk committee or you're at the finance and audit committee or whatever the case might be. And you need to be, so if you're at the finance and audit committee, they care more about costs. So you need to kind of reinvent the wheel and talk a little bit more about return on investment and things of that nature. So those are the 4 things I would do is, again, identify the third parties, measure your exposure, evaluate them, and then communicate the stuff.
Mm-hmm. So where are we at? And I'm going to go to a couple of topics that are a little bit tactical, but I don't know, maybe they're strategic. I'm just going to throw them out. We hear a lot about 4th party risk, 5th party risk, Nth party. where are we at on that in reality? Errol, is what's your sense on that, given your pulse on the healthcare, and I guess given the reality that people are still struggling just to manage the third party risk, where are we at on that? And is it happening? Is it not? Should it be? Should it not?
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing some activity in that area, and it's by being able to use some of these security rating services tools like RiskRecon to be able to get an understanding of, again, in my case, we're using it to look at who are the more popular service providers for the healthcare sector. So we use that tool, for example, to also understand who we should be keeping an eye on if there is a breach or an incident that we learn about one way or another, or if we're getting shared some information about vulnerabilities at certain companies. We will use that list to say, hey, this might have an impact on the healthcare sector. We should know about this. Yeah, let me leave it there.
Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I think Nth Party is coming to a movie theater near you. I think most people, like I said earlier on my call, they don't even take account for third party,
right,
let alone fourth, fifth, and whatever. But I think the biggest problem today is the problem of discovery. Again, there are usually two mechanisms in which we use to discover assets and discover vendors, or third party. And that one is using an IP address and one's using a domain. And it's very hard to correlate an IP address or a domain of a fourth party to a fifth party to a sixth party. So if you have, and again, I know, Kelly, you're dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, but when you have a security rating services scan, or when you conduct one and you identify all of the third parties that you're associating yourself with, the idea of correlating that third party to a SaaS service that they use is much more difficult than correlating the internal organization to the third party, right? So I think the more you go out into the wild, the more these nth parties will exist. And ultimately, this becomes a risk management conversation. If we're talking about seventh party, as an example,
yeah,
how much do I really care about that versus a third party? Yeah. Right? What level of trust do I put in one versus the other? Now, all of this, take this up to the business level, right? They need to look at purchasing decisions. They need to look at cost decisions. They need to look at legal clauses and contractual clauses. Cybersecurity is only one part of that, right? So you could come to a business person and say, listen, this person scored X on RiskRecon when we ran their scan. The idea is now you've started a conversation with that business executive because they were not aware of the intricacies of third party, fourth party, fifth party. So that discovery is helpful, but to the point where would it make a difference in terms of price and purchasing decisions and legal and contractual clauses? It depends. A third party, yes. A sixth party, probably not.
Okay.
Right. That's what I think.
One last question, and then we're going to turn it over to questions that have been submitted by folks. And let's be fairly quick on this. The importance of managing critical vulnerability exposure in the third-party ecosystem and beyond. You're thinking, Log4j, CodeCov, et cetera. So important. Is it essential capability or not? And yeah, your thoughts. Errol?
So I like the fact that I can leverage security rating service tools like RiskRecon when we have questions like that. So when a Log4j happens, can I quickly ascertain who may be impacted by that? I'll go back to the critical third-party suppliers as well. So it's not just the members that we're looking out on behalf of them, but also to answer the question, are critical third-party suppliers being impacted by that as well? So we can get a good handle on it and then take remediative actions if necessary.
Okay. Sam, anything to add?
Yeah, I think what Errol was talking about is the reactive approach, which is absolutely useful and necessary and instrumental in identifying your vulnerabilities and who might be impacted by them. But I go back to, what do you do before then? And do I think that going out into your armor and trying to patch every hole that you've got is a good use of time and a good use of resources? I don't think so. I think you need to establish what we call a risk-based vulnerability management program, where you actually take into account the risks, the actual risks of the organization that are impacted if a vulnerability were to be exploited. And the only example I'd give here, and I give this example all the time, a few years ago, we had the Spectre meltdown issue. If you guys remember, well, the only way an attacker could take advantage of a Spectre meltdown vulnerability was if they were able to break into the GPU and access the code, and then be able to get elevated privileged access into the environment, right? That's almost like parachuting in through the roof than walking through the front door, right? I would rather walk in through the front door and do a phishing attack and get some social engineering credentials and get in that way, right? So, these are examples of what I call academic vulnerability. Spectre meltdown to me was an academic vulnerability. But what happened when Spectre meltdown occurred? Everybody went out and patched their systems, right? And when they patched their systems, it actually caused more business disruption to some people than others, because there were some instability issues with a lot of that, right? So I always go back to that. So make sure it's a risk-based evaluation of your vulnerability management program, so you can arrive at the right decision.
Yeah. Who's running Intel processors in my supply chain? Okay, well, everyone.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Nate, you want to come back online and present to us the questions for our panelists here?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll try to get through all of them. We've had a lot. Feel free to submit, and we'll get as many of these as we can. So one of the first ones that I think would be good is, software bill of materials are being tested as a way to reduce vulnerabilities in the energy or medical industries, maybe some others. Do you see them becoming a common requirement, and how could they be enforced? Errol, I see you kind of nodding, especially related to healthcare. So why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of conversation and updated guidance from some of the regulators, including the FDA, about this topic, and I think we're going to see more and more of this. And short of saying it's a requirement at this point, I think we're going to see it at some point in the future. So I think it's a good thing. I know, Sam talked about the Spectre meltdown. It brought back some memories of where I was at the time dealing with all of that stuff. And the challenge that we had was, we knew we had it inside the organization, but some places it's tough to tell exactly where it is, right? So with things like S-bombs, you can use that at least as a place to at least start finding out, okay, if you have this vulnerability, where does it live inside the environment? So it ends that mystery for us and gives us a place to look. There's challenges in terms of like, can there be maybe some central repository of these things, and then when vulnerabilities come out, that repository can issue reports on what products may be vulnerable, for example. So as an ISAC, we're looking at maybe some of functionality like that we might be able to provide for the community. But I think there's a lot of good promise there to help solve some of the problems that we were working on back in the InfoSec days.
Awesome. Just in the essence of I'm going to move on to another question, Sam, that's directed right to you. Do you envision cybersecurity becoming even more important to companies abroad due to what's happening in Ukraine versus the cybersecurity of interest to U.S. companies? So basically, I think it's where do you see this becoming a priority now?
Well, I think in many cases, cybersecurity is a priority for lots of organizations around the world. I think where you start to see a lot of differences is the approach to cybersecurity in different parts of the world. So, the approach in the Middle East, for example, is still very much a tactical, checkbox compliance approach, as I like to call it, which is let's go, download ISO 20001 or NIST CSF, and let's implement every single control that's on there without an understanding of risk. Whereas if you look at the cybersecurity issues that you might find in, the greater China region, as an example, those cybersecurity issues are actually more related to the manufacturing and sort of the retail side of the house. Whereas in the United States, they tend to be a little bit more, federal, very much energy and utility and financial services centric. So I think in different parts of the world, different industries get different types of approaches to cybersecurity. What I think is really clear, though, is that everybody, whether you're in a US-based organization or not, your digital ecosystem footprint has some level of correlation to somewhere else around the world. Mm. So you may not know this, but again, we're talking about third parties and fourth parties. You may use a third party that procures the labor and resources in a different part of the world that you were not aware of, right? And that's why actually we're starting to see a lot of organizations that use sustainability measures for cybersecurity. They will only work with vendors that use some level of sustainability within their environment, whether that's, not doing business with certain companies because of geopolitical tensions, certain countries because of geopolitical tensions, or whatever the case might be. So that's the type of approach that I think would be different.
Awesome. Kelly, I want to direct a question your way here.
No, I'm asking a question. No, I'm just kidding.
This is an interesting one. And I'd actually like to get all three of your takes on this, but I think Kelly, starting with you, what do you think is the future of supply chain risk management, especially when it comes to things like vendor patches and hot fixes, and basically all of the different types of risk factors that we're seeing right now?
Well, maybe I'll give some advice, this is a total opinion. It's not like a prediction of the future, because I get future predictions pretty wrong. So listen, we correlate cybersecurity ratings, which I think are a worst case scenario. They're a rough approximation for how disciplined the organization is in managing the basics of cybersecurity hygiene. Okay, so even if you're not a fan, but when you intersect that data and the ratings that come out of that, and I don't really care which ratings platform you use, I think it's pretty common, is that companies that have poor cybersecurity hygiene have much higher rates of bad risk outcomes. They have higher rates of ransomware, they have higher rates of data loss events. And when I say ransomware events, like destructive ransomware events that are taking their businesses offline. Listen, we need to get to a place where people do business with people who have good cybersecurity hygiene as a rule. And that's just the requirements. And as we do that as a community, everybody's going to raise the bar and good things are going to happen. So I would like for us to get to that place so that and what's the point is that if you've got that baseline of doing business with organizations that have good cybersecurity programs and maintain that good cybersecurity hygiene and risk management, that you're not in the details of these kind of things about, did my vendor patch this or that? And you get to this point where you have this degree of confidence that things are happening. But I think because there's such a spectrum and still a distribution, as Sam said, it's just, you look at different approaches and there's different outcomes. So that's my answer. I'm curious in how other people respond to it.
Yeah, go ahead. Errol, what do you think? Future of supply chain risk management. What's something to note for everybody?
Yeah, well, what I would add to Kelly there, and Kelly's heard me talk about this before, is the team sport aspect of this. That, hey, we're all in this together, and I think the idea would be to really try to create a partnership relationship with those third parties and other service providers, as opposed to the way things start off with the contract being a very adversarial relationship when you get done with that thing. But again, partner with the third parties, work with them. Probably in a lot of cases, your InfoSec program is going to be more mature, more robust than some of the third parties you're dealing with. So share with them, work with them, try to help them improve, teach them why they need a better InfoSec program and how it can not only benefit them, but all of the customers that they're dealing with. So that would be my 2 cents to that.
Great. How about you, Sam?
Yeah, I do an annual pitch at our Gartner conferences called the Top Predictions for Cybersecurity for Year X. And last year, one of the predictions was that by 2025, we'll see about 60% of organizations using cyber risk as a primary determinant in making business transactions and third-party partnerships. creating third-party partnerships. And the reason I use the term business engagements in addition to third-party transactions is because I think this is also extending into things like merger and acquisition. So when you go out and acquire another party, you also need to take that into account. Investor relations. So I'm seeing more and more investor relations team add cybersecurity principles and goals and policies into their deck when they submit them out for regulatory approval or even investor just visibility, as part of a public company disclosure. So we're starting to see cybersecurity being built into ESG goals as an example. So I think, and to me, this is all third party, by the way. Again, this goes back to the first thing I said. Most people, when they say third party, they just mean vendor. Really, third party is about all this stuff. The way you look at investment, the way you deal with customers, the way you deal with regulators, the way you deal with vendors, all that sort of thing. So I do think it'll become more and more critical. Do I ever foresee it taking over the decision-making process? Maybe not, but it'll be a very significant factor in there.
Awesome. Let's do one more round robin question here that came through, which I think is a good one. And I'm going to make it a little more concise here, but how do you make the case to a board or executive leadership team that progress in a third-party risk management program depends on a collaborative investment process and a coordinated effort to ensure that it's done the right way? So how do you make the business case to really develop a TPRM program? Kelly, why don't we start with you again?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to in my experience as a CISO of a big bank and just in my consulting time, that bringing forward the data and exposing the reality of that data, bringing forward the facts about the outcomes that you're exposed to, and the supporting evidence that good risk management is going to get you better risk outcomes that the business cares about. And I think a lot of that goes back to the capability of resiliency that both Sam and Errol have talked about. That's so important, is that your organization is so interdependent on, and when you cut apart the supply chain, as Sam has suggested, identify those suppliers and what's at stake with each of those. I think by doing that exercise, you've inherently developed from that, you can develop a summary that really spells out a compelling argument for that business case.
Great. Errol, what do you think? What do you think is a key to making that case to your board or leadership team?
Yeah, I think I agree with where Kelly was going. I think on top of what he mentioned, I would say anything you can do to translate it into terms of dollars and cents when it comes to where those risk points are, I think that would go a long way in helping to make that case. And then being able to show likewise return on investment if we're able to reduce risk by investing this amount, whether it's in your cybersecurity budget or elsewhere, but that would help make that case.
Great. Sam, why don't you wrap this one up for us? What do you think are some keys to making this case to a leadership team?
I would say make them make the decision. Your job is not to make cyber risk decisions on behalf of others. Your job is to facilitate cyber risk decisions, and by doing so, you need to provide recommendations. The easiest example I could give is, we have a client who uses a gold, silver, and bronze model when they go in front of the board, and they say, if you want a gold level of protection, where we patch our systems within 72 hours, here's how much it's going to cost, and here's the type of risk it's going to mitigate. But if you want a bronze level protection, we're going to patch our systems within a week, and here's how much it's going to cost, and here's the type of maturity that it requires. And obviously, the bronze level protection is much cheaper than the gold level protection, right? But the key here is, regardless of whether they choose to go with the gold or with the bronze, they make that decision. They're accountable for that decision. But ultimately, either the gold or the bronze, they all fall within the risk appetite level of the organization. So we're okay with either one of these decisions, right? So that's what I would say is your job is to help facilitate decision-making, not make those decisions on behalf of others.
Great. Great. Thank you, Sam. Well, we are just past the top of the hour. It's a little past 2 o'clock Eastern time here. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's joined us today. It's been great. And thank you to our distinguished panel of speakers. We appreciate you all coming on. Kelly, is there anything you want to just throw out there before we end the call here?
Hey, the work we're doing is valuable. It's been great to chat with you, Sam and Errol, and thank you for everybody who attended. I hope this was helpful, and we hope to see you soon. Errol, I'll be seeing you at the Spring H-ISAC Summit in Florida. So, thank you, appreciate it.
Thanks,
everybody.
Bye.